Hello, everyone. We're here commenting on the NFL draft combine data and its effect on draft positions. My name's Andrew Kelly.
I'm Brendan McEwen.
I'm Cooper Shaver.
I'm Drake Mills.
All right, so first we wanted to talk about some of the research questions we had going into this. So first off, we wanted to talk about which combine drills, if any, are significant in predicting the draft positions. Second, we wanted to break that down to each position specifically and see if certain drills had a bigger impact on certain positions in their draft place. And then overall, is the combine a good predictor of judging where a certain player will be drafted?
So starting off, we had to get our data all set for pretty much to use. So we scraped combine and draft data for the past 20 seasons utilizing the functions on the bottom of the slide. We use those functions and then loop through each season in order to get the past 20 years of both of those datas. And then we had to clean the data, and this included renaming columns in order to make them more user-friendly when working in R, cleaning out bad values and nulls, and turning values that were as characters that should have been as numerics, turning them into numerics. So then we interjoined those two data sets, and so that we would only have players who both participate in the combine and were drafted. So starting off, we're going to start off with wide receivers here, and this plot on the bottom left, you can see there's a linear correlation where as your 40 time increases, your draft position also increases, which makes sense. Teams don't want guys who are slower, so they're going to be drafted later. So after looking at this visualization and a couple others, I ran a model with all these drills on pick, and I found that the 40 time was significant at the 1% level with a positive coefficient, sort of mirroring what was seen in the scatter plot. So as 40 time goes up, draft position goes up. And weight was also significant at the 5% level, but this had a negative coefficient. Moving on to defensive backs, the scatter plot on the top right demonstrates that as the 3-cone drill time increases for defensive backs, so does their draft position. And so after looking at this and other scatter plots, I ran a model, again, same model with defensive backs, and I found 40 time and 3-cone drill were both significant at the 1% level, and both had positive coefficients. So as both of those times increased, so did draft position, and broad jump was also significant at the 5% level.
So next, we decided to take a look at the offensive line. So grouped into the offensive line, we have guards, tackles, centers, and any other offensive lineman that just was considered O-line in the draft process. So first, we took a look at how their bench press reps correlated with the round that they were drafted in. And from the density plot here, we can see that the players in the first round, there was a lot less players below that 20 bench press reps threshold. And when you were drafting a first-round player, that was kind of really the baseline of that elite talent where you want to be over that 20 bench presses. Whereas in the other rounds, you do have players with high bench press reps, but they also have players with the lower reps. The model showed that broad jump along with the bench press reps were significant. And we figured this is because some of these physical traits that you're looking for in offensive linemen, they really come out well when you're testing them in the combine. So next, we tried to apply our offensive line model to defensive lines with making some important modifications. So the first thing that came to mind for us was speed. This is especially true for pass rushers, whether they're a D-end or an interior rusher. So we wanted to take a look at explosion and speed, and one of the first things we saw was the 40-yard dash. So the 40-yard dash had a positive correlation with the draft position, meaning that as your 40-yard dash time went up, you were tended to be drafted later. So we modified the model, like I said before, and we wanted to take those strength-based traits that we found with the offensive line and combine them with the more speed and explosiveness-based traits. So we found that our 40 time, the bench press, and the vertical leap were all significant at the 10% level. And all of those were correlated with the way that we would expect, where high bench press means being picked closer to that first round, whereas a high 40 time means you're being picked later on. So one thing I wanted to take a look at was defensive tackles versus defensive ends. So we saw that speed was important for the defensive line in general, but maybe that was being skewed by the defensive end. So I broke down each of the two position groups, and we found that 40-yard dash time is important for both of these groups, not just defensive ends. So although the correlation's stronger, it's still important for both. And we can see in the bottom right corner of the defensive tackle graph, some of these elite run stuffing nose tackles and one techniques, they tend to have these slower times, but they are still drafted higher. So there might even be more correlation with the speed in the general case when you're not talking about these elite run stuffers.
So next we looked at running backs, and the regression showed that weight, their 40 time, the broad jump, shuttle, and 3-cone were all significant. The two variables with the most significance were 40 time and 3-cone drill, which is kind of expected because they're running backs. And then I visualized the linear relationship between broad jump and pick in the draft. And as you can see, it has a trend where the higher your broad jump, the better you pick in the draft. Then I looked at linebackers, and I visualized vertical leap and pick in the draft, and I visualized some other of the variables too, and there wasn't much of a relationship between any of them that would show any kind of correlation with pick in the draft. And that also showed up in our regression as none of the combine's outcomes were significant in predicting their draft position.
All right, so the next position we looked at was quarterbacks. And initially I was actually thinking that nothing would be significant because it's most commonly noted that quarterbacks are considered the hardest position to scout and find success in. But we ended up having two stats both being significant in the model, and those being broad jump and 3-cone shuffle. Broad jump, however, had a negatively significant outcome, and the 3-cone drill was positively significant. But we obviously had to take out bench press when doing this model since quarterbacks don't compete in that in the combine. The next position we looked at was tight end. They had two drills that were very close to 1% significance, those being the 40 time and the bench press. And first, the 40 time had a positive significance, whereas the bench press was negative. This we assume to be because the faster tight ends can normally obviously get down the field quicker, are more known as the vertical threats, and the tight ends who bench more are normally considered to be a blocking tight end. They're normally stronger, and they're normally taken later in the draft. And then the final positions we looked at was pass rushers. For this, we combined the outside linebacker and edge rushers. And for this, the only variable we found significant was the 40 time. And this basically saying the fastest players got drafted earlier. It was a little bit hard to find other stats to be significant since combining outside linebackers and edge rushers, you have a large mix of bigger players and smaller players, and they're asked to do different things. So that's the main reason why we didn't think that there was going to be other significant values here.
So just to go over some of the conclusions that we can draw from what we found today. The NFL Combine, it provides great data, but this is sometimes overhyped by fans and the media that can lead to over or under drafting guys. However, there are certain skills that can prove to be significant, which is what we found with something like offensive linemen, defensive linemen, along those lines, where some of these skills can get captured. But basically, what we can come to is that the combine should be used as an important piece of the puzzle to drafting a player, not like a sort of catch-all. And as we saw with that offensive lineman there too, where they have that sort of bench press threshold at around 20, where there's not many of those guys drafted in the first round. If you're below that number, this sort of can raise red flags on a player, but it shouldn't really be used as a catch-all. And just to add to that also, what we looked at was just draft position. This doesn't necessarily correlate to performance, but more as where teams view players heading into the draft. So something that we could potentially add later to this project would be the production that these players achieve once they do make it to the NFL. Thank you, and let us know if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to answer them.